Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching World War I Part 2, 1915 by Epic History. Now last time we saw the opening phase of the war. Today we'll see as the war continues into 1915 and becomes truly entrenched, both metaphorically and literally, of course. Now if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
January 1915. World War I is just 5 months old, and already around 1 million soldiers have fallen.
Wow. I mean, look, obviously I'm aware of the immense toll of this conflict, the number of casualties, deaths, but that is such a rapid pace.
A war that began in the Balkans has engulfed much of the world. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, fight the Allies: Britain, France, Russia, Serbia and Montenegro, Belgium, and Japan. In Poland and the Baltic, the Russian army has suffered a string of massive defeats, but continues to battle German and Austro-Hungarian forces.
They continue to keep fighting, right? We saw in Part 1 that Germany's Schlieffen Plan, their invasion of France through Belgium, actually, as we saw, really relied on Russia being too slow to mobilize in time. Well, that was not necessarily the case. Russia, though it is this sort of big lumbering giant, wasn't quite as slow as Germany had expected / hoped. However, that doesn't mean things are going super hot for the Russian Empire, right? They are not having a fun time, though no one is, frankly, but they've faced a couple of pretty bad defeats, but they did manage to get on their feet faster than the Germans expected, and they've turned this into a two-front war for Germany, which is exactly what the Schlieffen Plan was supposed to avoid.
Austro-Hungarian troops have also suffered huge losses and are humiliated by their failure to defeat Serbia. In the Caucasus Mountains, Russian and Ottoman forces fight each other in freezing winter conditions. While on the
I mean, this all started, the assassination, essentially because after that, Austria wanted to dunk on Serbia. They were mad. And they've been given the chance to do that. Now it's totally spiraled out of control, but they've been given that opportunity, and they haven't really been able to take advantage of it. They're actually struggling in the fight against Serbia, right? Austria will struggle generally in this conflict, but it is a bit of a humiliation for them.
Western Front, French, British and Belgian troops are dug in facing the Germans, in trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland.
Total war. All right.
As part of the world's first strategic bombing campaign, Germany sends 2 giant airships known as Zeppelins to bomb Britain. They hit the ports of King's Lynn and Great Yarmouth, damaging houses and killing 4 civilians.
Yeah, I mean, we really see a lot of new things come to the table with this war, or I should say new things on such a large scale, right? With all the new technologies in place, the new strategy, some of the old strategy being used in accordance with these new technologies. Now, some of the things we'll see, in fact, most of them had been debuted in other conflicts or training, but this is just such a larger scale than had been seen previously, right? Earlier in the 1800s, you'd had the American Civil War, you had the Crimean War, you'd had conflicts, especially colonial conflicts since then, where we'd seen some of these new technologies, some trench making, some new weaponry at play, but just nothing of this scale. And so we see, for the first time, in this scale, we see air warfare, right? Warfare from above, a whole new domain to fight in, right? There have been bits and pieces in the past, but usually you'd had land and sea. Well, now you've got air. You have all these new technologies. You have trench warfare, which obviously very much characterizes this entire conflict, right? So we see a lot of things here that, like I said, were not necessarily entirely new, but they'd never been used on such a large stage before, at such high numbers.
At sea, at the Battle of Dogger Bank, the British Navy sinks one German cruiser, but the rest of the German squadron escapes. Command of the seas has allowed Britain to impose a naval blockade of Germany, preventing vital supplies, including food, from reaching the country by sea. Germany now retaliates with its own blockade.
Right, and they're talking about total war here. Of course, you'd had various forms of this in the past. The civilian population of various countries had been involved in some way with war during wartime. But it is, once again, to a new scale, right? The economies and citizenry of each of these countries is in large part mobilized to contribute to the war effort, right? They're not just fighting each other, they're setting up blockades, trying to block trade to each country, trying to block out food supplies. You'll see sort of an important part of this conflict, and especially with the involvement of the United States, is attacks on shipping vessels. Mostly unarmed, sometimes they actually were armed, but attacks on essentially civilian crafts, right? So the civilians, the economy, it all gets wrapped up into this conflict.
It declares the waters around the British Isles to be a war zone, where its U-boats will attack Allied merchant ships without warning. Britain relies on imported food to feed its population. Germany plans to starve her into surrender.
Yep.
On the Eastern Front, German Field Marshal von Hindenburg launches a winter offensive and inflicts another massive defeat on the Russian army at the Second Battle of Masurian Lakes.
I already made this point last time, but as we know, Hindenburg will become a very important German political leader. Very important, right? Following this conflict. So, this is someone that you absolutely want to keep an eye on to see how his exploits during the war contribute to his sort of popularity and leadership. Well, frankly, both during and following the war.
The Russians lose up to 200,000 men, half of them surrendering amid freezing winter conditions. The Russians have more success against Austria-Hungary. The city of Przemysl falls after a 4-month siege, netting the Russians 100,000 prisoners. Austria-Hungary's total losses now reach 2 million.
Damn.
Meanwhile, the British and French send warships to the Dardanelles to threaten Constantinople, capital of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. They believe a show of force will quickly cause Turkey to surrender. They bombard Turkish shore forts in the narrow straits, but 3 battleships are sunk by mines and 3 more damaged. The attack is called off.
Yeah, there's a lot of moments throughout the war, especially early on, when people are saying, this will end quickly, these guys are going to surrender quickly. It never happens as quickly as they hope. This is a conflict that drags on. It's a conflict that destroys several empires, right? The Austrian Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, right? Several empires are rent asunder by this conflict, but that doesn't mean that they give up quickly. Trench deadlock.
On the Western Front, the British attack at Neuve-Chapelle. But the advance is soon halted by German barbed wire and machine guns. British and Indian units suffer 11,000 casualties, about a quarter of the attacking force.
It's worth talking about. We mentioned last time, this is primarily a world war because of the European colonial empires, right? They started fighting around the world. But it's also a world war in the sense that even in Europe, you have troops drawn from around the world, right? Canadians, for example, a lot of Indians here, right? There's troops drawn from a lot of these European colonial territories. They're brought over to Europe to fight. or they're fighting around the world in their own countries, right? So this is an extremely international conflict, essentially wherever you look.
6 weeks later, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans attack with poison gas for the first time on the Western Front.
Yeah, so we talked about the new technologies. Here's a, relatively new technology that is being used for the first time in such scale. And of course, many of the new wartime technologies will become extremely controversial during this conflict. Some of them even banned afterwards due to the horrors that they inflicted.
A cloud of lethal chlorine forces Allied troops to abandon their trenches. But the Germans don't have enough reserves ready to exploit the advantage. Soldiers on both sides are quickly supplied with crude gas masks as a chemical weapons arms race begins.
I will say, this is, I do think, one of the more sort of harrowing aspects of this conflict, how brutal it was. A lot of sort of horror associated with this period, I find, is often associated with that gas mask. It's an image people find quite frightening because of, I think, everything associated with it, right? This is some pretty terrible stuff.
The Allies land ground troops at Gallipoli, including men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs. Their goal is to take out the shore forts that are preventing Allied warships reaching Constantinople. But they immediately meet fierce Turkish resistance and are pinned down close to the shore. The day before the landings, the Ottoman Empire begins the systematic deportation and murder of ethnic Armenians living within its borders.
Yeah, so if all of the war crimes weren't bad enough and civilian massacres, we've got a genocide that has begun to take place, right? This was really not a good time for the world. And by, this time, I'm talking essentially about World War I and running all the way through World War II. We saw immense levels of atrocity, never seen before and never seen since, right? So, you're doing any videos on either of the world wars, you're going to get a lot of this horrific conflict, war crimes, genocide.
The Armenians are a long-persecuted ethnic and religious minority, suspected of supporting Turkey's enemies.
Right.
Tens of thousands of men, women, and children are transported to the Syrian desert and left to die. In all, more than 1 million Armenians perish. The Allies condemn the events as a crime against humanity and civilization and promise to hold the perpetrators criminally responsible. To this day, the Turkish government disputes the death toll and that these events constituted a genocide.
Yeah, there's a lot of denialism of the Armenian genocide in Turkey, of course, in particular, but also around the world. This has changed somewhat recently, or is beginning to change, but for a long time, and still today, a lot of countries still do not recognize the Armenian genocide because they want to maintain a good relationship with Turkey. Some countries only recognize it very recently, right? So this has been an issue for a while, sort of the recognition of this event. German advances in the east.
On the Eastern Front, a joint German-Austro-Hungarian offensive in Galicia breaks through Russian defenses, recapturing Przemysl and taking 100,000 prisoners. It is the beginning of a steady advance against Russian forces. At sea, the British passenger liner Lusitania, sailing from New York to Liverpool, is torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland without warning.
Big moment.
1,198 passengers and crew perish, including 128 Americans.
I think I talked about this last time, but they mentioned the German U-boats last time. We talked about total war today, right? How this is engulfing a lot of civilians and civilian economies. And the German U-boats were particularly unpopular in the United States, right? Killing American civilians, attacking, a lot of these trade vessels. And so the Lusitania in particular was a very well-known incident in that sort of process of dragging America closer to entering the war. Of course, it'll be a bit before they do, but this is one of those events.
US President Woodrow Wilson and the American public are outraged. But Germany insists the liner was a fair target, as the British used her to carry military supplies. In May, the Allies launched the Second Battle of Artois, in another effort to break through the German lines. The French make the main attack at Vimy Ridge, while the British launch supporting attacks at Aubert Ridge and Festubert. The Allies sustain 130,000 casualties and advance just a few thousand yards.
Damn.
That summer, above the Western Front, the Fokker Eindecker helps Germany win control of the air. It's one of the first aircraft with a machine gun able to fire forward through its propeller, thanks to a new invention known as interrupter gear. Allied aircraft losses mount rapidly in what becomes known as the Fokker Scourge.
Here we see the sort of beginning of dogfighting, a la these planes fighting in the sky. Very iconic part of World War I, of course, would continue afterwards. And now we're getting to Italy's entry into the war. So we've seen Italy was supposed to be with the Central Powers, but sort of demurred when the war began. They were like, meh, we're not so interested. We don't really want to get into this conflict. Look, we agreed on a defensive pact, but this ain't defensive. So, I wonder on whose side Italy will join. I mean, I'm sure we all know, but it's sort of an interesting part of the conflict, right?
Italy, swayed by British and French promises of territorial gains at Austria-Hungary's expense, joins the Allies.
And we know Italy has got long beef with Austria-Hungary, or it's more accurate to say Italians do, right? Before Italy was a state, we're talking prior to the mid-1800s, Austria had a lot of influence throughout the Italian peninsula, but especially in northern Italy. And even, you can see on this map here, right, there's a lot of territory around this area, and frankly, going into the Balkans on the Dalmatian coast, that Italy would like to take from Austria-Hungary. Now, I mean, they have more broad territorial ambitions, but even more modestly, there's a lot of territory around here that Italy wants.
War on Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire and Germany. The Italian army makes its first assault against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River, but is repulsed with heavy losses. Meanwhile, the Allies face a crisis on the Eastern Front.
Uh-oh.
The Russians have begun a general retreat, abandoning Poland. German troops enter Warsaw on the 5th of August. Tsar Nicholas II dismisses the Russian army's commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nicholas, and takes personal command.
Yeah, so the Tsar, he really gets involved. He takes personal command. He's extremely involved in micromanaging the war effort. This does not go very well for him, because, I mean, if he wasn't being blamed already, now he is getting directly blamed for everything that goes wrong. It also takes him away from his political responsibilities and sends him towards the front lines, right? So if something's going on in St. Petersburg or Moscow, say, I don't know, protests that may lead to riots or perhaps revolution, Nicholas is not the quickest to respond, right? He's busy with the front lines. And of course, he's not particularly good at this job either. So this is just not a good idea from him.
It will prove disastrous for the Tsar, as he becomes more and more closely tied to Russian military defeat. At Gallipoli, the Allies land reinforcements at Suvla Bay, but neither they nor a series of fresh attacks by the Anzacs can break the deadlock. Conditions for both sides are terrible. Troops are tormented not only by the enemy, but by heat, flies and sickness. In the Atlantic, a German...
Of course, you know, a lot of countries around the world, everyone's got some stories from World War I or World War II that play a big part in their sort of national mythology. So what we're seeing there, a lot of this is still remembered by New Zealand and Australia today. As a big part of their sort of history.
U-boat sinks the liner SS Arabic. 44 are lost, including 3 Americans.
Uh-oh, not good.
In response to further US warnings, Germany ends all attacks on passenger ships.
Oh, well, there you go. Surely no conflict will break out between the US and Germany now. Surely Germany would never continue with the U-boats after they've agreed not to. Anyway, that's what we've got to now, is Germany is like, uh-oh, if we keep sinking these passenger ships, even if they do have guns on them for the Brits, the Americans may get involved, and that's bad news for us. So we're going to back off for now. The Great Autumn Offensive.
On the Western Front, the Allies mount their biggest offensive of the war so far, designed to smash through the front and take pressure off their beleaguered Russian ally. The French attack in the Third Battle of Artois and Second Battle of Champagne. The British, with the help of poison gas, attack at Loos.
Uh-oh.
Despite initial gains, the attacks soon get bogged down, with enormous losses on all sides.
Damn.
Allied troops land at Salonika in Greece to open a new front against the Central Powers and bring aid to Serbia. But the Allies are too late. Bulgaria joins the Central Powers, and their joint offensive overruns Serbia in 2 months.
There you go. Serbia finally taken down, with Bulgaria joining the war. It's worth pointing out that one of the conflicts sort of prior to the beginning of World War I, in fact, a couple of conflicts, are the Balkan Wars, where essentially, as the Ottoman Empire is crumbling, it's been crumbling throughout the 1800s, but into the early 1900s, the newly independent or becoming independent countries of the Balkans, as they fight for their independence, they gain it, maybe they're sort of autonomous within the Ottoman Empire, they begin to vie for territory. And at first, they're sort of united against the Ottomans, but as the Ottomans recede out of the region, they start fighting each other, right? So there's a lot of bad blood between the peoples and countries of the Balkans at this point, you know, as we've reached World War I.
Winter, the remnants of the Serbian army escape through the Albanian mountains. Their losses are horrific.
Yeah.
By the end of the war, a third of Serbia's army has been killed.
Yeah, Serbia sort of valiantly resists initially, and the resistance is always valiant, but, you know, they can't hold out in the end, and Serbia takes pretty devastating losses, both of military personnel and of civilians.
The highest proportion of any nation.
There you go.
Fierce fighting continues on the Italian front, as Italian troops launch the third and fourth battles of the Isonzo.
I will say this is something you see a lot of in World War I, are front lines that are so stagnant that you see the first battle of blank, the second battle, the third battle, right, as essentially the same battle continues to be fought in the same place, because, like I said, those front lines move so little.
Hungarian forces, though outnumbered, are dug in on the high ground and impossible to dislodge. In the Middle East, a British advance on Baghdad is blocked by Turkish forces at the Battle of Ctesiphon, 25 miles south of the city. The British withdraw to Kut, where they are besieged. The Allies abandon the Gallipoli campaign. 83,000 troops are secretly evacuated without alerting Turkish forces. Not a man is lost. it's one of the best executed plans of the war. The campaign has cost both sides $250,000.
Yeah, they managed to get out of there, but Gallipoli is sort of seen as a black mark on Britain during this war. Pretty devastating. Churchill, who's sort of in charge of the whole thing, it's a black mark on his record, right? So this was not a great moment. And it may be, like I said, it's a big part of Australian, New Zealand history. It may be remembered sort of valiantly, but it's not remembered fondly, right? This is a dark moment.
Casualties. 1915 is a bad year for the Allies. Enormous losses for no tangible gains.
Right.
But there is no talk of peace. Instead, all sides prepare for even bigger offensives in 1916, with new tactics developed from earlier failures. All sides still believe a decisive battlefield victory is within grasp.
Damn. Alright. That is the end of this part, 1915. Some more pretty devastating stuff. I mean, I could say that every episode, and I might, right? Each episode is going to be incredibly devastating. The amount of death and destruction that we're going to see, but that's World War I for you, right? And, of course, World War II as well. Great. What a nice period of history. It's interesting, though. It's very interesting. So if you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, linked down below, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.